Before she became myth, before she became the voice echoing through the folds of time, Betty Grof was simply a woman, waiting for someone she loved. There is a quiet tragedy in that, not in the waiting itself, but in how it consumed her. Love, for Betty, was never passive. It was devotion turned into momentum, an energy that drove her to rewrite the boundaries of what a human heart could endure. Her story begins not with magic or madness, but with the simple act of choosing to stay by someone who was already slipping away. Betty's life once belonged to the ordinary. She was curious, clever, quick-minded, a scholar drawn to ideas more than glory. Her days were filled with study and laughter, her world small but complete. Then came Simon Petrikov, the man whose intellect mirrored her own and whose warmth made the world feel infinite. Together they shared a rare equilibrium, two thinkers orbiting one another, their affection threaded through humour, understanding, and gentle ambition. To her, Simon represented not just love, but a shared way of seeing the universe, rational, hopeful, kind. When Simon began to change, when the crown began whispering its cold promises into his mind, Betty refused to see it as a loss. She saw it as a challenge. The woman who loved knowledge believed that anything could be understood, and what could be understood could be fixed. So when Simon disappeared beneath the Ice King's confusion and loneliness, Betty made a decision that would define her entire existence. She would follow him, no matter the cost. Love can be salvation, but it can also be gravity. It pulls even the strongest minds down into the places logic cannot reach. For Betty, love became an equation she could never solve, but could not stop trying to. Every step she took, every choice she made, stemmed from the same unshakable belief that Simon was still inside the madness somewhere, waiting to be found. She never asked herself what would happen if he wasn't. She couldn't, because the alternative was unthinkable. When she first crossed into the ruined future of U, Betty faced a world unrecognizable to her. Civilization was gone, replaced by a landscape stitched together by magic and memory. Yet even there, she saw signs of Simon, fragments of his kindness, traces of the man who once read her poetry and worried about the weather. She clung to those fragments the way sailors cling to driftwood, building hope from splinters. The scientist in her studied the world, the lover in her searched it. In time, those two selves became indistinguishable. Betty's tragedy lies in how fully she gave herself to a single purpose. In her pursuit to save Simon, she stopped saving herself. The longer she searched, the more her identity became tethered to him. Her curiosity, once open to the vastness of existence, narrowed to a single question: how to bring him back. Her brilliance became obsession. Her tenderness became endurance. Each act of love carried her closer to transcendence and further from who she once was. Yet there is beauty in her devotion. U remembers her as tragic, but tragedy in her case is not defeat, it is magnitude. Few beings in any realm have ever loved with such absolute intensity. Where others saw madness, Betty saw meaning. Where others gave up, she redefined the limits of sacrifice. Even as she crossed into realms beyond understanding, she remained human at her core, driven not by power, but by affection. Her love was her faith, and faith, in its purest form, is both light and shadow. In the quietest moments of her journey, Betty must have wondered if Simon would have wanted her to follow him this far. The answer, if she ever found it, did not stop her. Love had already become her truth. The Ice King might have forgotten her name, but she remembered his. Every spell she cast, every fragment of magic she unearthed, carried that name like a heartbeat. The tragedy of Betty Grof begins here, not in loss, but in devotion so deep that it becomes destiny. She steps willingly into a world where logic ends and love becomes its own kind of science. One that asks not how much can you understand, but how much can you give before you disappear. As the stars shift above the broken world and the winds of magic carry echoes of forgotten lives, Betty continues to search, one woman against the silence, one heartbeat chasing another across eternity. She does not yet know what it will cost her. She only knows that she cannot stop. Betty Grof's journey begins with love, but it continues with desperation. When the person you love most in the world disappears not by death, but by transformation, grief becomes something unrecognizable. It is not a clean loss. It lingers, alive and unfinished. Simon Petrikov is not gone. He exists in another form, buried beneath madness and ice. For Betty, that distinction is everything. She cannot mourn him because he still breathes. She cannot let go because he still exists somewhere she cannot reach. And so, to bridge that impossible distance, she descends into magic. Magic, in the world of Oo, is both wonder and danger. It does not obey reason. It rewrites it. For someone like Betty, a woman of intellect, precision, and curiosity, it represents both temptation and terror. Science gave her stability, but science cannot bring back what she has lost. And so, with trembling hands and an unbreakable heart, she does the unthinkable. She trades the comfort of understanding for the chaos of possibility. Her descent is not an explosion of power. It is gradual, deliberate, almost methodical. She studies the fragments of old magic left behind in the ruins, tests its logic, dissects its patterns. To others, her pursuit might seem reckless. To her, it is simply the next experiment. Every failed spell, every ancient text, every sleepless night brings her closer to an understanding that both terrifies and fascinates her. The laws she once trusted begin to bend, and she bends with them. There is a particular loneliness in this transformation. The rational mind resists surrender. She wants to believe that there is a way to use magic without losing herself to it, to study it without succumbing. But magic demands participation, not observation. It seeps into her thoughts, whispering of shortcuts and miracles. At first, she resists. She writes notes, builds formulas, tries to impose logic on the illogical, but in time, she realizes that love itself has never obeyed reason either. If she could believe in a man cursed by a crown, she can believe in forces that defy science. The descent is not just intellectual, it is emotional. She is no longer trying to understand magic, she is beginning to believe in it. Betty's tragedy deepens here, because belief, once opened, rarely closes. The more she learns, the more she realizes how little control she truly has. Magic demands sacrifice, sometimes small, sometimes absolute. Every spell takes something from her, her sense of time, her fear of the unknown, her boundaries between what is possible and what should not be touched. But each cost seems worth it if it brings her closer to Simon. If she can just find one more clue, one more secret, one more impossible key, maybe she can rewrite what the crown has done. What she does not yet understand is that magic in Oo does not fix, it transforms. It does not return what was lost, it changes what remains. She searches for restoration, but finds evolution instead. Her own identity begins to shift in the process. She grows quieter, sharper, more resolute. Her compassion hardens into determination. Her mind, once wide and curious, narrows into a single point of focus. Simon. Magic, she begins to realize. Mirrors emotion. The more desperate her heart becomes, the more volatile her power grows. And yet, in those early stages, there is still beauty in her descent. She learns things no human has ever known, how thought can shape reality, how memory and matter intertwine, how the heart itself can influence the fabric of the world. She discovers that the distance between mind and magic is thinner than anyone ever guessed. For a brief moment, her studies verge on enlightenment. She can feel the universe breathing with her, responding to her will. The boundaries between science and sorcery dissolve. She has never been closer to the truth, or further from herself. Her encounters with the relics of U's magical history begin to change her perspective. She sees traces of the world before the Mushroom War, the alchemy, the arcane experiments that once sought to master chaos and instead became it. The ruins warn her, but she does not listen. She recognizes the danger intellectually, but love and logic have long since parted ways within her. Each step deeper into the unknown feels justified by devotion. If I don't do this, she tells herself, no one else will. That thought, half truth, half delusion, becomes her mantra. The further she descends, the more isolated she becomes. No companion can follow her where she's going. Her research stops being about shared discovery and becomes an inward pilgrimage. She starts to lose track of time, of seasons, of the world's small rhythms. Even her reflection begins to change, not physically at first, but in expression. Her eyes carry the stillness of someone who has seen too much and refuses to turn back. At some point, Betty stops asking whether Simon can be saved and starts asking what saving means. If she can't return him to who he was, can she at least end his suffering? Can she free him from the Ice King's confusion, even if it means losing him forever? The questions grow heavier. Magic has opened doors she cannot close, and behind everyone is a different version of love, some selfless, some selfish, all-consuming. In U, power never comes without consequence. The energy she channels begins to leave traces on her mind. Strange visions flicker at the edges of her consciousness. Memories of Simon layered over the ruins of reality. Moments that never happened but feel real. She doesn't know if they are illusions or glimpses of possible worlds. Either way, she keeps going. Her descent is not madness yet, but it has already passed the point of reason. Still, there are moments of clarity, small flashes of the woman she used to be, when she stops to rest, when she looks at the night sky, when she remembers the sound of Simon's voice. Her humanity returns like a tide. She knows she is changing, and that knowledge frightens her. But she also knows that transformation is the only path left. To stop now would mean accepting that love has limits. And Betty Grof has never believed in limits. The descent into magic is not a fall. It is a choice repeated endlessly, a surrender given one breath at a time. She believes she is moving towards salvation, but every step carries her further from the world she once knew. The air around her hums with unseen power. The horizon glows faintly blue. Somewhere, far away, a crown whispers across dimensions, and she listens, not because she wants its promise, but because she still believes she can outsmart it. The tragedy is already written in that belief. But for now, Betty does not see it as tragedy. She sees it as love in motion. She sees it as purpose. And for a time, that is enough to keep her walking deeper into the unknown. The further Betty Grof travels into the realm of magic, the more she realizes that the greatest cost of devotion is not the loss of what you love, it is the loss of yourself. Her mind, once a cathedral of structure and thought, begins to fracture beneath the weight of paradoxes she can no longer contain. Logic bends, time unravels, and reality folds in on itself like a reflection in water. She still knows who she is, or who she was, but that knowledge grows dimmer with each act of power she performs in Simon's name. Betty's mind was once a sanctuary of reason. Every idea had its place, every feeling could be examined, understood, labelled. But love is not a theory, and magic is not a science. The deeper she goes, the more those boundaries dissolve. Her thoughts begin to take on the qualities of the forces she studies, fluid, unpredictable, recursive. Where once she saw clear distinctions between subject and object, now everything blends. To think of Simon is to see him. To love him is to feel him near. To fear losing him is to make that loss real. The mind that once defined the world is now shaped by it. This is the quiet beginning of her collapse. It does not come through madness or sudden revelation, but through subtle erosion. Every spell she casts alters her slightly. Her voice changes tone. Her thoughts move in circles. The clarity of science gives way to the language of intuition and impulse. What she cannot explain, she accepts. What she cannot control, she embraces. She still believes herself to be rational, but rationality is no longer the foundation she stands on. It has become the shadow she follows. There is a paradox at the heart of her transformation. She becomes powerful in proportion to how much she surrenders. The less she insists on control, the more the universe seems to open to her. Magic rewards her faith, but demands her identity in return. She begins to understand that selfhood, like any structure, can only exist within limits, and she is learning to move beyond limits. In moments of stillness, she wonders if this is what Simon experienced when the crown first spoke to him, the intoxicating feeling of power and dissolution intertwined. In one sense, she is closer to Simon now than ever before. They are both beings suspended between intellect and madness, each consumed by a force they sought to master. But where Simon's loss was accidental, Betty's is chosen. She walks willingly into the same storm that claimed him, convinced that she can find him at its centre and pull him out. What she does not see, what no one can see when they are inside love's gravity, is that she is not pulling him back. She is following him in. Her body begins to reflect the change. Not visibly, not yet, but subtly. The world around her responds to her emotions in ways that defy natural law. Flames flicker when she grows frustrated. The air shimmers when she remembers his face. Dreams and waking blur. Magic has stopped being a tool and has become a language written through her entire being. She no longer channels it, she embodies it. The more she surrenders to this state, the less she belongs to the human world. She stops sleeping for long stretches. Hunger fades. Time feels less like a line and more like an ocean she can drift through. She sees moments from her life, and Simon's overlaid upon the present, like constellations of memory. Sometimes she speaks aloud and realizes she's been talking to no one for hours. Sometimes she hears her own voice echoed back by something that sounds almost like her, but not quite. These are warning signs, but Betty no longer interprets them as such. She has crossed the point where logic can intervene. Her love for Simon, once the anchor keeping her grounded, now becomes the force that accelerates her unravelling. Every memory of him fuels her determination. Every trace of his absence sharpens her need. The more she loves, the more she loses. The equation has inverted. Itself, what once connected her to him now, separates her from everything else. And yet, she does not resist. To her, this collapse feels like transcendence. It feels like finally understanding what Simon must have felt. the burden of infinite knowledge and the loneliness of carrying it. There is a strange comfort in that recognition. If she must lose herself to find him, so be it. It is not despair that drives her now, but a sense of inevitability. She believes she was born for this, to be the one person who could follow him beyond the limits of sanity and still remember his name. But memory, too, begins to waver. She starts to forget the small details that once defined her, the colour of her old home, the taste of coffee, the sound of her own laughter. These memories slip away quietly, not because she doesn't care, but because they no longer fit the shape of her new existence. She is no longer just Betty Grof, the scholar, the fiancée, the human. She is becoming something else, something that carries Betty within it, but is no longer defined by her. In rare moments of lucidity, she feels the fear return. She wonders if Simon would recognize her now. If he saw her standing before him, eyes bright with magic, thoughts pulsing with unearthly rhythm, would he still call her the same name? And if he did, would she still answer? The question haunts her, but she does not linger on it. There is too much work to do, too much love still left unfinished. She convinces herself that she can always reclaim what she's lost once Simon is free. It is the oldest lie of devotion, that self-sacrifice can be reversed once love's goal is achieved. The truth is simpler and harder. Every step she takes deeper into power makes return impossible. But love is not rational, and neither is faith. And so she continues, one thought, one spell, one heartbeat at a time, until her reflection in the world of magic is no longer distinct from the forces that shape it. There comes a night when she looks into a pool of still water and sees Simon's face instead of her own. It is not a vision or an illusion. It is memory and magic layered perfectly together. For a moment she smiles, thinking she has found him. But when she touches the surface, it ripples, and the face dissolves back into hers, strange, luminous, no longer entirely human. She realizes then that she has not found him at all. She has become part of the same transformation that took him. The collapse of self is not destruction, it is redefinition. Betty Grof, who once loved Simon Petrikov, is still there, just smaller now, like a name whispered beneath waves. In her place stands something vaster, something that cannot be entirely named or understood. She feels grief and awe at once. She has crossed the line between love and oblivion, and she does not know which side she stands on. Yet even now, at the edge of herself, she still clings to one thought, clear and unwavering. He is worth it. That belief, fragile and immense, is the last human part of her that remains. It glows faintly in the dark, the smallest light in the endless current of power she has become. It is not reason that saves her from disappearing completely. It is not even love in the ordinary sense. It is memory, the promise of a name spoken long ago that keeps her tethered just enough to continue. For now, that is all that remains of Betty Grof. A name, a purpose, and a love strong enough to eclipse the self that carried it. There comes a point when love refuses to die, even when everything that sustains it is gone. For Betty Grof, that moment arrives after selfhood has already begun to unravel. What began as devotion has now transcended the normal boundaries of time. The linear sequence of days and years that once governed her life no longer applies. She does not move forward anymore, she moves through. She exists across moments, crossing centuries as easily as thoughts, all in pursuit of one purpose: to find Simon Petrikov somewhere beyond the flow of time and to bring him home. Time, to Betty, becomes less a measurement and more a terrain. The magic she has come to wield bends it gently around her, warping the distance between past and present. The world no longer feels like something happening to her. It feels like something she can step in and out of, as if her emotions themselves are coordinates. The past is not behind her, it surrounds her, bleeding into the present. She can almost feel Simon in every timeline, a lingering resonance that guides her forward. It is not hope anymore that drives her, but instinct, like a compass forever drawn to a single soul. Her pursuit leads her to places where the very concept of reality feels unsteady, the borderlands between dimensions, where time curls in on itself and memories crystallize into form. These places are not meant for humans. They are quiet, cold, echoing with fragments of forgotten histories. Yet to Betty, they feel strangely familiar. She moves through them with the same determination she once brought to her research, cataloguing anomalies, measuring distortions, trying to impose order on infinity. But infinity does not yield. It only reflects. The search becomes cyclical. Every discovery loops back to where it began. She learns to sense temporal fractures, moments where two realities brush against each other, and through them she glimpses what might have been. There are flashes of Simon before the crown, his smile untouched by madness. There are flashes of the Ice King, lost and babbling in another age. And sometimes, when the veil is thin enough, she almost feels him looking back. Those glimpses keep her moving, even as each one reminds her that he remains just out of reach. Time itself begins to speak to her, not in words, but in patterns, repetitions, echoes, coincidences too perfect to ignore. She starts to notice symbols recurring across centuries, ideas reappearing in different forms. It is as if the universe itself is trying to communicate with her through rhythm, and the message, though she cannot articulate it, feels both comforting and cruel. That love does not end, but it also does not grant reunion. It continues, endlessly, beautifully, separately. Betty refuses that truth. She does not want love to exist without resolution. For her, love has always been an action, something to do, not something to feel. She begins to manipulate time more aggressively, bending it, forcing it to open, pulling at the seams of causality. Each time she does, her understanding deepens, but her humanity thins. The more she sees, the less she belongs anywhere. She has become a traveller without an origin. Her experiments with time are both brilliant and catastrophic. She discovers that moments are not destroyed when they pass. They simply fold, overlapping endlessly. Everything that ever happened still exists somewhere, vibrating at its own frequency. By tapping into those vibrations, she can reach the edges of old realities, ghost moments that flicker like candlelight. She moves through them, searching for the one moment she cannot let go of, the instant Simon was lost. If she can just return to it, if she can just step back into that fracture, perhaps she can rewrite it. But time resists correction. Every attempt she makes to change what happened instead creates new versions of events, subtle variations that echo outward, fracturing possibility itself. In some, she arrives too late. In others, she saves him but loses herself sooner. The universe seems to conspire to keep their separation constant, as though some cosmic balance depends on it. Betty begins to suspect that her love for Simon is not merely personal, that it has become woven into the structure of reality, an equation that cannot be solved without undoing everything. There is a tragedy in how she handles this realization. Instead of despairing, she doubles down. Her love transforms into a kind of faith, not in Simon's return, but in the act of searching itself. The search becomes her existence. She no longer imagines an ending. She simply continues. In the folds of time, she becomes a whisper, a constant variable moving through ages. The creatures of Oo, who encounter her across eons, speak of her as myth, a spirit of devotion, a wanderer who bends the laws of time in pursuit of a forgotten name. Yet, even as she transcends, small pieces of her humanity remain, flickering like embers. Sometimes she pauses to watch the sunrise over a world she no longer belongs to. Sometimes she hums a melody she half remembers, something Simon once played on an old instrument. These moments anchor her, faintly, to what she was. They remind her that the purpose of love was never control, but connection. And though she cannot yet accept it, she begins to sense that the connection she seeks may no longer exist in the form she wants. Time, for all its cruelty, begins to teach her gentleness. When she sees civilizations rise and fall, when she watches the same mistakes repeat in infinite variations, she begins to understand that permanence was never part of life's design. She sees that love, too, must follow the rhythm of impermanence, not to vanish, but to transform. This realization terrifies her, because if love changes, then so must she. And change, for someone who has given everything to a single goal, feels like betrayal. Still, the universe continues to speak to her in its quiet language. Through the distortion of time, she hears the echo of Simon's voice, not calling for her, but simply existing, distant and peaceful. It is the sound of someone who has accepted his fate. It is everything she cannot yet do. She reaches for him across the divide, and for a moment it feels like she touches something real, a memory, a thought, a presence. But when it fades, she does not feel anger, only stillness. For the first time, she begins to question whether the purpose of her search is to find Simon at all, or whether it has become a way to avoid finding herself. In that quiet, suspended moment, the concept of Betty feels small, almost irrelevant. She has become a current in time's endless river, a feeling that the universe carries forward. The scholar, the lover, the traveller, all of them are layers of the same truth. Love that endures beyond its origin eventually stops being love for another person and becomes love for existence itself. Betty is not ready to accept that yet, but the seed of that understanding has been planted. Time, which once felt like an enemy, is beginning to reveal itself as a teacher. The woman who defied centuries for love is learning that eternity cannot be conquered, only understood. The search continues, but it is changing. What began as a desperate chase is becoming a dialogue between Betty and the cosmos, between love and acceptance. Somewhere, deep within the spirals of time, Simon's name still calls to her. She still answers, but her voice now carries something new. Not just longing, but peace beginning to take root. In the vast silence between realities, where even time itself loses direction, Betty Grof encounters the force that will one day define her final act, Golb. To call Golb a being is almost inaccurate. It is not life or death, not good or evil. It is entropy, the pure dissolution of form. Where Golb moves, meaning itself comes undone. Creation, emotion, identity all unravel into static. To most minds, such a presence can only be terror. But to Betty, standing at the edge of her long, collapsing search, Golb is something else entirely. It is the mirror image of her own journey, absolute unmaking. When she first senses it, she does not understand what she's feeling. It is not sight or sound, but a vibration that resonates with every corner of her being. It feels ancient, infinite, empty, and yet deeply personal, like an echo of every question she has ever asked about love, loss, and existence. Golb is the universe's final answer, spoken in silence. She follows that presence through the rift between worlds, drawn not by curiosity, but by inevitability. The further she goes, the more the laws of reality begin to thin. Matter folds into itself, space bends, and memory becomes indistinguishable from dream. Here, even her love for Simon feels abstract, less an emotion and more a pattern of energy she carries within her. She realizes, with a kind of awe, that Golb does not destroy because it chooses to. It destroys because destruction is the universe's way of resetting, of remembering what it was before anything existed. Betty has spent so long trying to fix the irreversible, to heal what was never meant to be permanent. Now she stands before the embodiment of impermanence itself. For the first time, she hesitates. If Golb is the end of all structure, then it is the one force that even love cannot outlast. But instead of recoiling, she feels something like recognition. Love and entropy, she realizes, are not opposites. Both dissolve boundaries, both erase the self. Both are acts of surrender. This is the most dangerous insight of her journey and the most profound. It is here, in the presence of Golb, that Betty begins to understand that her love for Simon has already carried her beyond individuality. She no longer wants to save him because she believes she can fix him. She wants to save him because she cannot bear the thought of his pain persisting when the rest of her has already accepted oblivion. Her love has become universal, but still tethered to a single name. The encounter with Golb is not a moment. It is an unfolding. Its shadow stretches across every part of her consciousness. The closer she comes to its centre, the more her remaining humanity flickers. She begins to hear whispers, not words, but impressions. They are not commands. They are reflections of her own thoughts, amplified. She senses that Golb is not aware of her in the way creatures are aware of things. To Golb, all existence is one continuous surface. Every soul, every atom, every heartbeat is part of the same infinite skin. Betty, once a woman of science, now understands this intuitively. She is not facing an enemy. She is facing the foundation of everything. And in that realization lies the paradox that defines her tragedy. She feels peace in the presence of what should terrify her. The closer she gets to Golb, the quieter her mind becomes. For centuries, she has fought chaos, tried to impose meaning on a world that refused to hold still. Now, in the presence of pure unmaking, she feels a strange kind of rest. The constant noise of thought, the equations, the regrets, the relentless drive to fix, all dissolve. For a fleeting instant, she feels what Simon must have felt at the beginning of his fall, a strange mercy in surrender. But Betty Grof is not someone who can rest for long. Even here, at the edge of existence, she cannot stop caring. Her humanity, though faint, endures. It pulses, like a heartbeat, within the vast indifference, Golb's being. And within that heartbeat lies her last question. If Golb is everything, destruction, creation, time, chaos, can it also contain love? Can something that unravels all meaning still recognize devotion? Her rational mind tells her no, but her heart refuses to believe it. She begins to sense that Golb's silence is not emptiness, but potential. That beneath its void lies the raw material of all emotion, all consciousness. Perhaps, she thinks, love is not destroyed by Golb, it is simply transformed by it. That possibility becomes her new purpose. She no longer seeks to defeat or escape the cosmic force. She seeks to understand it. Over time, though time no longer means anything here, she learns to listen to the rhythm of Golb's essence. It pulses, expands, contracts, like the breath of a sleeping god. She realizes that she can survive within it not by resisting, but by harmonizing with its chaos. Her thoughts become quieter, slower, more spacious. She begins to move not as a being of will, but as a pattern of intention. Golb does not notice her presence, but she notices it in every vibration, in every flicker of light and dissolution. The deeper she merges into that rhythm, the more she understands that her journey has always been leading here. All her attempts to fix, to save, to control, they were expressions of the same impulse that drives the universe itself, to seek connection through transformation. The crown transformed Simon. Magic transformed her. And now, Golb offers transformation beyond either comprehension or control. In this state of near union, she sees Simon again, not as a man, but as a pattern of memory and emotion woven through the same cosmic field she now touches. Their forms no longer matter. What remains is the recognition between two consciousnesses that have endured too long apart. In that recognition, she feels something like forgiveness, not from him, but from herself. The shadow of Golb is not an ending, but a choice. Betty could allow herself to dissolve completely, to let go of all memory, all identity, and merge with the fabric of entropy itself. It would be painless, it would be peace. But in the faint pulse of her humanity, she feels a final duty. Simon still exists. Somewhere, the man she loves is still bound to his curse, still wandering the corridors of madness she once swore to end. So she makes her decision. She will not vanish into Golb's silence. She will speak into it instead. She will turn entropy into mercy, love into transformation. If Golb is the end of all things, then she will teach it one last lesson, what it means to save something, even at the cost of oneself. That thought becomes her anchor, her final act of defiance and devotion combined. The scholar, the lover, the lost traveller, all dissolve into purpose. The shadow of Golb surrounds her completely now, but she is no longer afraid. The infinite emptiness stares back at her, and for the first time in the long history of her life, she feels no separation between what she is and what the universe is. In that perfect equilibrium, she whispers a promise that only the cosmos can hear. A promise not of salvation, but of understanding. Love and chaos are not opposites. They are the same act, seen from two sides. And as Golb's vast presence folds around her, Betty Grof steps into destiny, not to be erased, but to become part of the universe's heartbeat itself. All long journeys arrive at a moment that is both decision and destiny. For Betty Grof, that moment is the one in which she stops trying to bend the universe and decides to offer herself to it. She has traced every thread of possibility, broken herself across the grain of time, and stood in the shadow of the one presence that can erase all meaning. And then, with a clarity that feels like silence after a storm, she chooses not to conquer, not to reason, not even to hope. She chooses to surrender, deliberately, lucidly, and with love. Surrender, in her case, is not defeat. It is a form of authorship. For years, she tried to write a cure into the world, a remedy for the crown's corruption, a rescue for a single human heart trapped beneath ice and confusion. But cures are not always written with ink and instruments. Sometimes the only way to alter an equation is to become a term within it. Betty's choice is exactly that. She steps inside the problem, offers herself as its new variable, and lets the universe rebalance around her. The terms of this surrender are both spiritual and precise. She understands, as only a scholar can, that the crown is an amplifier, not a conscience. That power without intention simply expands whatever it touches. She understands, as only a lover can, that Simon's intention was always tenderness, even when the crown refracted it into cold. When she places herself between Simon and the force that deformed him, when she threads her will through the same field that once consumed his, she is not pleading with fate. She is proposing a new constant. Let harm pass through me and end here. There is an ethics to the moment that only grows clearer the longer one looks at it. Simon did not choose the loss of himself. The crown selected him, exploited a scholar's curiosity, and turned it into endless winter. Betty chooses what he could not. She steps forward freely, sees the abyss, and says yes. This is not martyrdom in the shallow sense, not a gesture aimed at being witnessed. It is the most private kind of offering, a trade no one can validate for her, and no one can make in her place. Consent here is the entire meaning. The sensation of surrender is unlike anything she has felt in all her experiments, all her travels. Power had always been a current she could catch, steer, survive. Now it becomes an atmosphere. She is not pushing through it, she is breathing it. The boundaries that still circled her mind, memories of old rooms, the calendar of a lost life, the human proportions of fear, dissolve into a wider geometry. Thought slows and deepens. Love is no longer a feeling that points at Simon. It is the medium in which she moves. Her devotion expands until it is indistinguishable from the field itself. From the outside, the world registers a sequence of changes, a collapse of danger, a parting of clouds, a man whose eyes look human again. From the inside, Betty experiences none of it as spectacle. There is no triumphal chord, no final image to hold. There is only a release so complete it feels like truth. The crown's logic, so loud for so long in Simon's life, loses its leverage. The current that once selected him finds a larger harbour. Where compulsion once gripped a single mind, it meets a will that offers neither resistance nor compliance, only absorption. The force has nothing to push against. It settles, it quiets, it lets go. This is the paradox of her choice. Surrender functions as mastery. Nothing breaks. Everything is returned. The man who was scattered across years by a cursed idea becomes finite again. He is not restored to a prior version of himself. No one returns to what they were before they were broken. But he is released from the mechanism that kept him broken. The ice that had made a home of his thoughts melts into memory. In the warm vacancy that follows, a mortal life reappears. Hunger, tiredness, a pulse that ticks in ordinary seconds, not mythic beats. But legends are not measured by what is returned. They are measured by what is given. Betty's selfhood, already thinned by time, magic, and purpose, does not disintegrate into nothing. It is repurposed. The part of her that once arranged books on a desk, that once traced constellations on a city map, becomes an organizing influence within disorder. Not a ruler, not a prison, not a voice that commands. Rather, a tendency toward grace within entropy. Where dissolution would have been brutal, it becomes clean. Where endings would have been jagged, they are precise. This is what her surrender accomplishes at the scale no witness can see. It teaches chaos to finish gently. The cost is absolute. There is no path back to rooms and mornings, to shared coffee, to the small proofs of a life. Surrender is not a bargain with a secret escape clause. It is exactly what it declares itself to be. Those who will later look for Betty will not find a body. They will not find a signal. They will find, if they are sensitive enough, a kind of mercy where there should have been none. They will feel it as an absence of a worse outcome, That is her shape now, not a silhouette against the sky, but a softening inside catastrophe. It is tempting to call this erasure. It is not. Erasure removes without remainder. Betty's act leaves remainder everywhere. In the man who can at last be merely human, in the friends who do not have to live under a sky that never thaws, in the world that survives a meeting with the unspeakable and does not go mute, and in the metaphysics of it all, in the way reality remembers having been caught by a pair of human hands and lowered, not dropped. The universe does not forget such instruction. It is written through outcomes, not inscriptions. Of course, the human mind resists the idea that love could conclude in dispersion. We want reunions. We build stories around returns. But Betty's story refuses the easy arc because it aims beyond it. She does not deliver the past back to the present. She delivers the future from being cancelled. The man is spared the pressure of embodying a miracle. He is simply alive, painfully and beautifully ordinary. The miracle has gone elsewhere, where miracles belong, into the foundations, where they hold. There is an argument, sometimes whispered in corners of thought experiments and late-night conversations, that love is at its most suspect when it asks a person to stop being a person. Betty's surrender appears, at first glance, to illustrate that suspicion. But look more closely. Her choice does not emerge from coercion, cult, or delirium. It emerges from a sequence of lucid recognitions. What the crown is, what Simon cannot bear, what her will can carry, and what the world needs in order not to break. The personhood in her decision is not erased, it is radicalized. She uses the last inviolable right any being has, the right to determine the meaning of its own end, and spends it on another's beginning. There is also the question of Simon's agency. Would he have wanted this? He never asked for such a price to be paid. He was the first victim of a logic that normalized sacrifice by disguising it as discovery. Betty, who saw that logic's trap with the unflinching eye of a scholar, refuses to repeat it. Her act does not continue the crown's story, it interrupts it. The difference is everything. Where the crown consumed, Betty converts. Where the crown insulated its subject from consequence, Betty takes consequence into herself and distributes it into harmlessness. The ethics of her act is not that someone must pay, it is that harm must be translated into something that does not propagate. After the choice, time does not applaud, it resumes. The world does what worlds do. It heals in places, it scars in others, it remembers and forgets with unequal vigour. Simon breathes as a man among mortals. He will not immediately know how to live. The muscles that lift a coffee mug are different from the muscles that conjure a blizzard. He will shake, he will wake in the night and reach for a crown that is no longer there and feel a phantom weight. He will grieve, not because he can name what he has lost, how could he, but because relief is a kind of grief when it arrives after years of distortion. He will learn to inhabit the calendar again, and he will carry a tenderness for the air itself without fully knowing why. Those who loved him will find themselves caught between celebration and silence. Celebration because he is himself, silence because someone else is not. They will struggle with how to speak of a gift that cannot be thanked directly. They will look skyward and feel that the sky is different. They will adopt new rituals without declaring them. Pauses before laughter, carefulness in anger, the impulse to repair what can be repaired, because they have lived through a day when repair on the grandest scale occurred and asked nothing in return. If there is a place where Betty remains visible, it is in these habits of mercy. The world she saved becomes the archive of her presence. Not a monument, not an anthem, but a bias in the fabric of things toward gentler endings. She has not taught the cosmos to love. That would be too sentimental for the precision she practiced. She has taught it to release. Humans and candy folk and beasts and spirits will not know why some disasters taper instead of explode, why some falls end with a bruise and not a break. They will call it luck, they will call it grace. It is the memory of her choice, distributed as policy across the reel. And what of Betty's own continuity? Language fails here because it is trained on bodies, voices, and faces. Continuity, as she now experiences it, does not resemble a person moving through days. It resembles a principle recurring in outcomes. The same way a number travels invisibly through an equation, shaping the sum without appearing in the final line. If she still answers to her name, it is only in the supple, most secret syntax, the grammar by which the universe recognizes an act freely given and does not waste it. The tragedy of Betty Grof, then, is not that she disappears. It is that the scale of what she becomes exceeds the scale at which we know how to mourn. We are built to cry for rooms left empty, for letters unfinished, for hands that cannot be held. But how does one grieve a kindness installed in the laws of events? How does one miss someone whose last location is everywhere, the worst thing might have happened and didn't? The answer is simple and impossible. We live well. We let the saved world be the thank you. There is nonetheless a lingering tenderness in the idea that somewhere within the quiet core of chaos, a human intention persists, not as command, as colour, not as rule, as tendency. It does not need to be conscious to matter. But if it is, and some nights the air itself feels like evidence, it would not be unhappy. It would be busy with its one beloved task, easing the seam where endings meet everything else. This is the shape of her surrender. A transformation that releases a man to his mortality, relieves a world of a pressure it could not survive, and relocates a woman's love to the only place large enough to hold it. The act contains no plea for remembrance and no mechanism for return. It is consummate, complete. And yet, because love never truly occupies only one form, it keeps echoing in songs, in small rescues, in the softened aftermath of accidents, in the hush that sometimes follows a quarrel when both sides step back and the worst thing does not get said. What remains for those who tell her story is to refuse the false choice between romance and philosophy. Betty's decision is both. It is the grandeur of feeling applied with the rigour of thought. It is a scientist's final experiment, conducted at the largest scale, with a hypothesis no instrument can verify and a result everyone inhabits. It is the conclusion of a life that began in libraries and laughter and found, beyond calendars and coordinates, a way to make meaning outlast form. And so the choice to surrender becomes the axis of the entire tragedy. Not an ending in which love loses, but a proof in which love changes category. It stops being a promise about two people and becomes a property of the world they shared. The man returns to mornings. The world returns to weather. The force that unmade meanings learns, once and forever, how to pass through a human vow and come away, changed. This is how Betty Grof disappears, which is to say, how she remains. When Simon Petrikov opens his eyes again, the world feels both familiar and impossible. The cold that once lived in his bones is gone, and with it, the heavy silence that used to fill every thought. For the first time in what feels like eternity, he can breathe without hearing the echo of the crown's whispers. The air tastes like rain, soft and ordinary. He is alive, mortal, fragile, and that fragility is what stuns him most. Simon has lived in two realities, one of clarity and one of confusion. The scholar who loved Betty and the Ice King who haunted Oo are both versions of him, but they do not coexist easily. Now that he has returned to himself, he finds that both ghosts linger. The man he was before the crown cannot return unchanged. The man he became beneath it cannot be erased. He stands at the threshold between them, not a victim anymore, but not yet whole. The world calls it salvation. To him, it feels like starting over inside someone else's life. In the beginning, he does not understand what has happened. There is only the afterglow, a strange lightness where once there was burden. He remembers flashes. Betty's face, her voice, her defiance, the feeling of something vast folding around them both. And then, stillness. He knows she is gone. The knowledge does not come as shock or revelation. It arrives as certainty. She has done what he could not. She has freed him, and the cost of that freedom is her absence. Simon's first days back in the world are quiet. The Candy Kingdom is rebuilding from the chaos that followed Golb's appearance, and the people of Oo, though changed, are alive. He walks among them like a ghost, the only human in a world that has forgotten what humans once were. The sunlight feels too bright, the sounds too sharp. Everything that was once background noise, footsteps, laughter, birdsong, now feels overwhelming. Mortality, he realizes, is not just the condition of dying. It is the condition of feeling everything again. There is kindness waiting for him in that new life. Finn visits often, his optimism undimmed by all he has seen. Marceline checks on him too, though she hides her concern behind humour. They treat him not as a legend, but as a person learning how to exist again. Yet Simon struggles to accept their warmth. Gratitude feels inadequate. Guilt feels inevitable. Every kindness reminds him of the price that was paid. Every act of compassion is a quiet echo of Betty's last gesture. He begins to dream of her, not as she was, but as she became. In some dreams, she is still human, reaching for him across time. In others, she is light, voice, and silence, all at once. He wakes from those dreams with tears on his face, and the same unanswered question in his heart. Did she choose this freely? Or did he let her go too easily? The guilt is heavy, but so is the love that accompanies it. He knows she would not want his grief to become another prison, yet grief has its own gravity. Simon spends long hours in solitude, trying to rebuild the habits of a normal life. He returns to what he understands: study, reflection, the slow rebuilding of intellect. Books become his companions again, but not in the same way. Before, knowledge was escape. Now, it is remembrance. He reads to keep himself tethered to the world she saved for him. Each page, each idea, is a way of saying thank you without words. He begins to write as well. Notes, observations, reflections on what he has seen. Not to publish, not to prove, but to remember. He does not want the story of Betty Grof to become a myth, stripped of its truth. He writes to ensure that her choice remains human, not divine. At first, he writes about her with scientific detachment, as though recording a phenomenon. But the longer he writes, the more his language softens. Facts give way to feelings. Observation turns into confession. He writes of her laughter, her patience, her stubbornness. He writes about the way she always challenged him to think harder, feel deeper, live fuller. He writes about the unbearable tenderness of knowing that she loved him enough to give herself to the universe. And when he runs out of words, he sits quietly, because some gratitude is too large for language. The people of Oo begin to tell stories about Betty too. They speak of a woman who disappeared into the stars to save the world. Some say she became a goddess of balance. Others say she lives on in the wind. Simon listens to these stories with mixed emotions. He knows that myths are how people make sense of the incomprehensible, but he cannot bear to think of her as distant or divine. To him, she will always be the woman who laughed with him over shared books, who believed that every mystery could be solved, who stayed human even as she touched the infinite. As months pass, Simon begins to recover a rhythm, not happiness exactly, but stability. He learns to cook simple meals. He takes walks by the river and watches the light change across the water. He builds small machines with no purpose other than curiosity. There is still sorrow in him, but it coexists with gratitude now. The ache of loss and the warmth of love have become inseparable. Sometimes he talks to her aloud, not because he expects an answer, but because silence feels too heavy otherwise. He thanks her for each new sunrise, for every breath that does not hurt, for every laugh that catches him by surprise. In those small acts, he begins to understand that Betty's gift was not just freedom from the crown, it was permission to live again, to love the world without needing to control it, to see beauty without trying to preserve it forever. Simon's greatest challenge is forgiveness, not of Betty, but of himself. He knows that he was the one who put on the crown, who vanished into obsession, who left her alone with an impossible burden. He cannot undo those mistakes, but slowly, through reflection and through the kindness of others, he learns that guilt is not the same as memory. Memory is sacred. Guilt is noise. Betty did not save him so that he would carry a new form of torment. She saved him so that he could carry peace. There comes a day when Simon visits the place where she vanished, the site where Golb's shadow once tore through reality. The world there is still strange, faintly humming with leftover magic, but calm. He stands in the quiet and speaks her name, not as plea or lament, but as a statement of truth. "You're still here," he whispers. And though he hears no reply, he feels something shift, a stillness, a warmth, an almost imperceptible easing in the air. It is enough. He does not stay long. He knows now that closure is not found in sacred places, but in the simple act of continuing. As he walks back toward the city, he feels the weight of mortality settle fully into him, the good kind of weight, the kind that grounds rather than traps. He realizes that being alive, truly alive, is not a reward. It is a responsibility to live kindly, to love gently, to honor those who can no longer do so. Simon Petrikov is no longer the Ice King, nor the scholar he once was. He is something new, a man rebuilt by love and loss. His mind, once fractured by magic, now holds a deeper kind of knowledge, that salvation is not escape, but endurance, that peace is not given, but learned, and that love, once it has changed the universe, never truly ends, it only changes form. When night falls, Simon sits outside and looks up at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond time and definition, he knows Betty still exists, not as a person, but as a principle. In every act of mercy, in every moment of release, in every breath of quiet understanding, she lives. And though she is gone, she has not left him behind. She has simply gone ahead. He smiles softly, tears warming his eyes. For the first time, the ache in his chest does not hurt. It hums, it glows, it feels alive. That is how Simon knows he is home, again. The world that follows Betty Grof's sacrifice is one both quieter and stranger than before. There are no signs in the sky, no monuments, no divine announcements. Her absence does not arrive with thunder, it settles like dust. The noise of Golb's chaos fades, the Candy Kingdom rebuilds, and Ooh exhales for the first time in what feels like centuries. But beneath the surface calm, something fundamental has shifted. The world continues, yes, but it continues differently. No one speaks of it outright, not at first. There are simply changes that people begin to notice. Conflicts end with less bitterness. The land seems softer, the seasons more balanced. Even the creatures of chaos, the ones who once lived by instinct and violence, seem subdued. It is as though the world itself has learned to breathe with a new rhythm. Marceline notices it when she walks under the stars. Finn notices it in the way the wind sounds across the fields. Even Peppermint Butler, whose mind dances constantly with questions of magic and consequence, senses that the very fabric of reality has been tempered. What once was harsh now hums with quiet grace. None of them name it for what it is, the lingering echo of Betty Grof's surrender. She has become something invisible yet omnipresent. A quiet adjustment in the world's tone, a correction written into its harmony. The devastation she prevented has left no scar, only gentleness. It is perhaps the most profound kind of influence, the one that cannot be traced, only felt. The world without her is not mourning. It does not collapse in grief, it thrives. That, paradoxically, is her legacy. The ability to be absent without leaving emptiness. Betty's story does not end in a monument or a legend that demands attention. Instead, her presence lingers in the small ways life continues to choose kindness over destruction. Still, those who knew her most closely feel the gap in their own ways. Marceline, who once envied Betty's closeness to Simon, now finds herself carrying a respect that borders on reverence. She plays songs that sound like prayers, though she'd never call them that. In the quiet verses, her voice trembles with understanding, not just of loss, but of transformation. She has watched Simon rediscover what it means to live, and through him, she honours Betty's love. Princess Bubblegum too feels the change, though she rarely admits it aloud. She once studied magic as a system to control, to measure, to contain. After Betty's disappearance, she begins to study it differently, not as an equation, but as a language of relationship. She sees in Betty's act the proof that intellect and emotion are not opposites, but extensions of each other. Her research becomes gentler, her policies fairer. The Candy Kingdom, once a monument to control, begins to grow more organic, more forgiving. Peeby does not say it, but she feels as though Betty's influence lingers in every act of compassion she allows herself. And Simon, the man Betty saved, becomes the living embodiment of her memory. His presence in Ooh is like a scar turned into a symbol of healing. Wherever he goes, he brings with him an awareness of what was sacrificed, not to burden others, but to remind them that even the smallest life holds infinite meaning. The world looks at him and sees not the tragedy of the Ice King, but the endurance of love. He himself cannot always bear the weight of that perception, but he accepts it with quiet humility. His life has become her message made flesh. To continue is to honour. Over time, the myths begin to form. They are inevitable. The world needs stories to make sense of miracles. Some say Betty became a guardian of balance, a being woven into the fabric of creation to prevent chaos from ever taking root again. Others say she became Golb itself, not as destruction, but as compassion, the universe's reminder that even entropy can be kind. None of these tales are entirely true, but none are false either. Like all myths born from love, they are expressions of longing, ways for mortals to touch the infinite. The world without Betty is still imperfect. Wars return in smaller scales. Old tensions resurface. There are still arguments, losses, mistakes. But everything feels just a little softer, as though the worst possibilities have been cushioned by an unseen hand. When disasters strike, recovery comes quicker. When cruelty arises, empathy follows sooner. It's as if the universe itself learned patience from her, the kind that listens before it judges, that pauses before it punishes. In moments of quiet reflection, Simon senses her most vividly. The world speaks to him in subtle gestures. When rain begins, just as he feels the weight of sadness, when the stars flicker in a pattern that feels familiar, when silence feels less empty and more alive, he knows she's there. Not as a ghost or spirit, but as equilibrium. She has become part of the equation that keeps reality balanced, the unseen constant that turns chaos into music. The beauty of the world without her is that it does not know her name, and yet it carries her everywhere. Children born long after her disappearance grow up under skies made gentler by her touch. The rivers flow a little clearer. The dreams of Uao's creatures are less haunted. Even those who have never heard of her benefit from what she gave. Her legacy is not something told, it is something lived. Yet in some corners of the world, traces of her can still be found. In the ruins of old libraries where Betty once studied, the air still hums faintly with residual magic, not dangerous, but warm. The books that survived the passage of time sometimes fall open to pages that speak of forgiveness, of courage, of the laws that connect emotion to existence. Scholars of the future who read those passages feel an inexplicable calm, as if the knowledge itself were smiling back. The world changes in small, almost imperceptible ways. Finn, grown older and wiser, begins to teach others not about war or glory, but about compassion. He speaks of Simon as a friend, and of Betty as the unseen lesson behind every act of mercy. His students may not grasp the full story, but they carry its essence forward, that love, in its truest form, is not about holding on, but about letting go with grace. Even the magical forces of U seem altered. Spells that once warped or consumed now feel more balanced, their outcomes less cruel. Those who practice them with respect find them gentler, more predictable. Magic itself seems to have learned empathy, an inheritance of Betty's human heart. If Betty Grof could see the world she left behind, she might not recognize it at first. It has grown, changed, softened in ways that defy measurement, and yet she would understand it instinctively. It is the world she dreamed of when she first decided to follow Simon, a place where intellect and kindness coexist, where creation and destruction dance in harmony, where love is not a weakness but a force of design. In the quiet moments between day and night, when the world seems to pause, U hums with a subtle resonance, neither sorrow nor joy, but something in between. It is the sound of balance. It is the echo of Betty Grof. And though no one can point to her, though her name has become a whisper that time itself forgets, the truth remains written in every heartbeat, in every act of mercy that ripples outward unseen. She is gone, and yet she is everywhere. Memory does not preserve the world as it was. It recasts it in the light of what endures. For Betty Grof, whose final act no mind can fully picture, memory becomes the only architecture capable of holding what she did. It exists in fragments, a gesture recalled by a friend, a kindness that has no obvious cause, a shift in the wind, on a day that should have ended worse than it did. None of these alone is Betty. Together, they form her contour, not a portrait, but a silhouette drawn by absence. This is the shape of memory, not the body that left, but the space it taught us how to fill. Simon learns this first. In the early months, he tries to remember precisely dates, objects, the order of conversations, the texture of ordinary days before the crown. Precision feels like devotion. He thinks that if he can keep the facts intact, he will keep Betty intact too. But facts behave like snow under warm breath. They shift, soften, become luminous at the edges. The more he tries to hold them, the more they glow and blur. He realizes, with reluctant tenderness, that memory has no duty to accuracy. Its duty is to meaning. And meaning, where Betty is concerned, resists measurement and insists on radiance. So he begins to remember by gesture instead. Not the letter she wrote, but the way her hand hovered over the paper, choosing patience before ink. Not the first time she corrected one of his theories, but the small, conspiratorial smile she gave him after, as if improvement were a private joke they shared with the universe. He remembers the angle of her attention, how she listened not to reply, but to understand, how her silence never punished, only prepared a gentler answer. In these recollections, she is less a sequence of events and more a method, a way of meeting the world. The Candy Kingdom, too, remembers her by method. Monuments do not rise for Betty. It would offend the truth of her gift, which was to remove herself from the centre. Instead, memory turns into practice. Healers rest a moment longer with the injured, waiting for fear to ebb before lifting a bandage. Engineers refuse the clever solution that humiliates the user and choose the humble one that dignifies them. Judges pause before verdicts and ask, not, what balances the scales, but what prevents the wound from widening? None of this is credited to a name. It is simply how things are done after. Practices become customs. Customs become culture. Culture is memory dissolved into the bloodstream. Princess Bubblegum resists this at first. Her mind is built for ledgers, and ledgers demand entries. She wants a record that says, here is the threshold where the world bent kinder. But the deeper she looks, the more the threshold recedes. It was not one day. It was many small days, each one persuaded by the last. She trades dates for diagrams, models of influence that have no single centre, only currents. In the margins, she writes a quiet admission that surprises her. The most durable memory is behaviour. Then she closes the notebook and adjusts a policy to fit a feeling she cannot justify in numbers. This, too, is remembering. Marceline remembers differently. For her, memory is sound. She does not attempt the historian's clarity or the scientist's map. She chases resonance. In a half-lit room, guitar balanced against her ribs, she finds the chord that carries Betty's gravity, not sorrow alone, but the steadiness underneath it. She adds a melody that rises and doesn't resolve, because the story did not. When the song ends, silence remains generous, not empty. The listeners cannot say what the tune was about. They only breathe easier. That is her proof that she has remembered honestly. Across U, memory takes on local colour. In the Wildberry districts, bakers fold a pause into recipes so sweetness can decide itself. In the grassy halls of treefolk, elders tell a brief story before every hard decision, a parable with no moral, just a praise of 9 disease, reminder that choices sit inside lives, not above them. In seaside towns, sailors pour the first cup of tea over the rail, an offering to what held us last time. None of these rituals mention Betty. They do not need to. Memory that has done its work stops saying the name and starts keeping the promise. Not all memory is kind. There are corners where it curdles into speculation, the comfort of an answer pretending to be reverence. Some insist that Betty planned everything from the first day she met Simon, that genius is simply foresight plus love. Others claim she became a cosmic adjudicator who will punish carelessness with exquisite precision. These stories sound powerful. They are only frightened. They reduce the wildness of a human vow into a system that can be managed, worshipped, or feared. The antidote is not argument, but example. The world keeps healing without bureaucracy or superstition, because memory prefers practice to doctrine. Simon discovers a gentler antidote in the play of forgetting. He reads old notebooks and finds gaps he cannot bridge. Instead of forcing the bridge, he leaves it as a window. Through it he looks not for the lost detail, but for the feeling that framed it. This is how he recovers mornings. The light on a kitchen cup, the gravity of an unfinished sentence between two people who trusted pauses. He notices that when he stops interrogating memory, it stops defending itself and starts offering hospitality. He learns to enter a recollection as one enters a room someone loved, quietly, willing to leave things where they are. Artifacts complicate the lesson. The world is littered with objects that bear the temperature of their makers. Simon keeps one or two, a pen, a threadbare scarf, then discovers they do not behave like relics. They warm up when handled by the living. Their power is not to freeze the past, but to accompany the present. He lends the scarf to a friend on a cold walk and feels no sacrilege, only accuracy. Betty, who spent her life in motion toward others, would not want to be remembered by anything that could not be shared. There is, nonetheless, a temptation to consecrate. A small group proposes a shrine to the unknown patron, a place where people can leave thanks for disasters that didn't happen. Simon attends the meeting and listens. The idea is sincere and slightly wrong. He suggests something else. A bench in a public garden, unmarked, placed where conversations naturally slow. They build it. Over months, strangers sit, and some of them forgive each other there. A child falls asleep in a parent's lap there. Two enemies agree to postpone harm there. No plaque ever says why. The bench remembers by functioning. Peppermint Butler, who speaks the grammar of magic as easily as breath, explores memory at the level of forces. He notices a change in spells whose endings were always violent. They now have exits where once there were walls. He diagrams this as an introduced leniency, then corrects himself, a learned leniency. He concludes that reality does in fact remember, not by storing images, but by adjusting likelihoods. He files the scroll away and, in his private notes, writes the only sentence that matters. She taught it a habit. Habits are how memory survives time's teeth. Years turn, rulers change, children who never heard the old names copy the practices because they feel right in the hands. A mason pauses before striking the final blow on a stone, listening for the seam that will split clean. A teacher closes a book early and lets a conversation finish the lesson. A traveller mends a fence he did not break. These gestures proliferate with no central plan. They are not inspired by Betty. They are inspired by what the world feels like after her, slightly more breathable, slightly more repairable. Yet memory has another shape, the honest one that includes pain. Some nights, Simon's dreams return him to ice and babble, to rooms where his voice is not his own. He wakes ashamed of a past he did not fully author. The shape of Betty in those moments is not a comforting vision. It is a boundary. He sits with tea cooling in his palms and tells himself the one memory that does not blur. She chose. Her last act was not an accident that obligates him to misery. It was a gift that invites him to gentleness. He practices accepting the invitation. On good days, acceptance arrives like weather. The young ask questions with the clean cruelty of innocence. Did she come back? Was she a hero or a person? Why can't we see her? The elders answer without embroidery. No, both in that order. Because some things are true without being visible. Children understand this faster than grown-ups. They have not yet learned the superstition that only the seen is real. They adopt memory as play. They invent a game called Hold the Moment, where everyone must be still for as long as they can, then burst into laughter precisely to break the spell. It is foolish. It is perfect. It says what the philosophers write badly, that we honour the stillness best by releasing it. Art becomes a neutral ground, where honesty and myth can meet without injuring each other. Painters stop trying to paint Betty's face and paint edges instead, shorelines at dusk, thresholds of doorways, the instant before rain. Poets write elegies that never use her name and are more faithful for it. A puppeteer stages a play with two figures, one who builds a cage to save a bird, another who opens the door before the song ends. Children cheer the second and do not argue the theory. Art remembers by staging choices, not by embalming outcomes. There are, of course, those who insist that memory must culminate in doctrine. They write treatises arguing that Betty's act proves the universe is ultimately benevolent or ultimately indifferent, or some clever hybrid that flatters their anxieties. The world does what the world always does with such certainties. It nods politely and continues. Fields need harvesting. Bridges need maintaining. Friends need visiting. Memory's most stubborn shape is ordinary labour done with unusual care. The rest is commentary that cannot lift a cup. On a winter evening, long after the smoke of great events has left the sky, Simon hosts a small gathering. No occasion, simply soup, bread, light. They talk about unimportant things until the unimportant becomes the thread that stitches a day to its neighbour. Someone asks, softly, whether he fears forgetting her. He shakes his head. He has learned that forgetting is not the opposite of memory. It is its colleague. The mind cannot carry everything. It must relinquish detail to keep meaning. He points at the people in the room, at the street beyond, at the steam rising from bowls. This is what I remember, he says. No one argues, because the room itself feels like proof. Near midnight, after the last cup is washed and the last chair returned, he steps outside. The air is clear. The stars are not messages. They are stones burning gently at distances that have nothing to do with human sorrow. He does not ask them for a sign. He does not require mercy to look like coincidence. He has come to trust memory's final shape, a practice of noticing. He notices that his breath does not hurt. He notices that he is not alone. He notices that the quiet is not empty. He says her name once, not to summon or to anchor, but to place the word where it belongs among the true things. If memory had a map, it would show no monuments. It would show paths worn smooth by feet that pause at thresholds and choose softness over spectacle. It would show benches without plaques, kitchens with 2 cups, even when one would do, laboratories where the last line in the notebook is a question that makes the next person kinder. It would show a world that, when offered the chance to be exact or to be good, chooses to be good, and finds, afterward, that the exactness it needed has arrived on its own. This is the shape of remembering Betty Grof. Not a shrine that demands attention, but a bias toward repair. Not an anthem shouted upward, but a habit practiced sideways. Not a calendar date darkened in grief, but a series of mornings in which the worst thing does not happen, and no one can say exactly why. The failure to explain is not a defect, it is fidelity. Some gifts are so completely given that the right way to recall them is to use them without ceremony. Eventually, even stories loosen, as they should. New names rise. Children who were not there teach other children what they themselves were taught. Pause, listen, release. Someone will ask, decades hence, who began this way of doing things. An old woman will shrug and say, someone who loved someone, and that will be both inadequate and exact. The world will keep that sentence the way a harbour keeps the outline of the boats that have left, not by clinging to them, but by still being the place where arrivals are possible. And in that harbour, every so often, a wind will pass that feels like recognition. It will not speak, it will not claim, it will do what wind does best, carry. We will breathe, and the breath will steady. We will look at one another and see, for a second, how memory has arranged our faces into a family that does not require relation. We will go on. That is how she remains, as the way we continue. Devotion is often spoken of as if it were simple, as if it could be measured in acts of service or sacrifices made in the name of love. But for Betty Grof, devotion was not a single gesture or a promise fulfilled. It was a living, breathing philosophy, a quiet form of rebellion against the world's expectations. In the end, the question of whether Betty's choice, her act of love and surrender, was truly ethical is not one that has an easy answer. It is not an equation to solve, but a lens through which the world must be seen. Betty never intended to be remembered as a martyr or a hero, but as someone who loved deeply enough to question the very nature of sacrifice. Her devotion was not bound by the constraints of what was expected from her as a lover, a scholar, or a woman. Her devotion came from a place outside of duty. It was not born from necessity, but from desire, and not from a desire to possess, but to release. The very idea that love could require such an immense sacrifice, such a leap of faith, is what makes her act so deeply philosophical. Her devotion was ethical, not because it was a sacrifice, but because it was freely chosen. There is no greater freedom than the choice to let go, to release the ones we love from the weight of our own expectations. And yet, in this release, Betty paradoxically offered Simon the chance to be free, not in the sense of returning him to a past life or restoring him to a former self, but in the sense of allowing him to finally live as a man, not defined by the crown or by the burden of the Ice King. But devotion does not always come without consequences. The ethical question that arises from Betty's actions is not whether her love was worthy, but whether she had the right to make such a decision for Simon. Could she have chosen differently? Could she have lived a life alongside him without sacrificing herself? Was her devotion noble, or was it born from a place of desperation, a need to fix what could never be fixed? These are the silent questions that hang over her legacy. When Simon returns to Oo, he does not immediately recognize the fullness of what Betty did. He is not yet equipped to understand the depths of her sacrifice. In many ways, he continues to be defined by what he lost, by the years that the crown stole from him. His love for Betty is complicated by guilt, by the sense that he could have done more, been more. He struggles with the truth of her sacrifice, as anyone would who wakes from a long, confusing dream and finds themselves alone, without the clarity they had once had. And yet, the beauty of Betty's devotion lies not in Simon's understanding, but in the way it transforms him. Over time, he comes to accept the gravity of what she gave, and in that acceptance, he begins to learn the true cost of love. It is not simply an exchange of affection. It is a quiet act of trust, of letting go of control, and of letting another person carry the weight of what we cannot. Simon slowly realizes that Betty's devotion was not just an act of selflessness, It was an invitation to live fully, to stop seeking to undo the past, and to find a way forward in the midst of loss. And here, the ethics of devotion are most clearly revealed. It is not about what is given, but about what is allowed to remain. Devotion, in its purest form, is not about claiming someone, but about giving them the space to exist as they are. Betty's sacrifice did not bind Simon to a past he could not escape. Instead, it released him from the weight of the crown, allowing him to rediscover his humanity in the way he had always wanted. She did not demand his gratitude. She did not expect him to repay her sacrifice. She simply loved him enough to let him go, and in doing so, she allowed him to come back to life, in his own way, on his own terms. For Simon, this realization comes slowly, as all profound understandings do. He feels Betty's absence like a wound that cannot heal. But he also feels her presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as something living inside of him. Her devotion continues, not as an obligation, but as a quiet whisper in the corners of his life. The questions he once had about whether he deserved her love no longer matter. What matters is that her love has freed him to live differently, to live fully. This is the ethical core of Betty's devotion, not in the acts of giving, but in the freedom it provides. Love that asks nothing in return is not self-sacrifice. It is selflessness born from a place of deep, knowing strength. Betty did not give up herself to save Simon. She gave him the opportunity to save himself. She allowed him the space to grow, to heal, and to find his own path. She understood that love cannot be forced into a singular shape. It must be given the freedom to unfold in its own time, in its own way. But there is also another layer to her devotion. The question of what it means to sacrifice one's own identity for love. Betty's sacrifice was not just a decision to love Simon, it was a decision to become part of a force greater than herself. Her identity, once rooted in her intellect and her role as a scholar, dissolved in service of a larger, more universal truth, that love cannot be bound by time, space, or even logic. It is something that exists, outside of human comprehension. Betty's devotion was an act of becoming, not of losing. She gave up the woman she was not to save Simon, but to become part of a larger, unknowable force of the universe. In doing so, she proved that devotion does not always mean diminishing oneself. Sometimes it means enlarging the heart, expanding the capacity to hold and to give without measure. The ethics of devotion, then, lie not in the sacrifice itself, but in the willingness to surrender what is unnecessary. Betty did not need Simon's love in return. She did not need to be remembered as a saint or a hero. What she needed was to act, to choose, to be love in the most pure, unselfish form. She chose the hardest path, the one that demanded the most of her, but she did so without expectation. The true measure of her devotion was not in what she gave up, but in what she allowed to grow in its place, a quiet understanding that love is not a force that can be controlled, but a power that must be set free. Her legacy, then, is not just the fact that Simon was freed, but the fact that U learned, through her example, what it means to love with totality, to love not to possess, but to release, to love not to change, but to allow change, to love, finally, in a way that frees both the lover and the beloved. Her devotion was a living philosophy, and it was not meant to be understood all at once. It was meant to be lived, to be practiced, until it became part of the world itself. In the end, the question of whether Betty's devotion was ethical is not one that can be answered by any measure of the human mind. It is a question that can only be answered by how the world moves after her. and the world moves with gentler steps. The ethics of devotion, as Betty showed, are not in the hands of those who give, but in the hearts of those who learn how to receive, and in the spaces they create for each other to grow. Continuity is not the same as repetition. Where repetition loops back on itself, stuck in its own patterns, continuity moves forward, carrying the lessons of the past without being anchored to it. It allows the past to breathe within the present, not as a weight, but as a foundation. In the aftermath of Betty Grof's choice, the choice to surrender herself for Simon, for U, and for the balance of the universe itself, the world that she left behind becomes not one of stagnation, but of quiet, gradual transformation. Her gift is not the illusion of a world that remains the same, but a world that grows from the roots she planted. Simon, in his return to himself, is the first to experience the gift of continuity. At first, he feels it as something faint, like the warmth left behind when someone who has been loved walks away. It is not a presence that dominates or forces itself upon the landscape of his life, but something subtler, the absence of something worse. He is no longer haunted by the crown, and though the shadow of his past still lingers, it no longer governs his future. He moves through the world as a man unburdened by time, freed from the memories that once defined him. This is continuity at its most personal, the ability to live without the weight of what has already been lost. In the broader world of U, continuity begins to take on a shape that is felt, not seen. The wars that once defined the rhythm of life slow, not because of some grand proclamation or decree, but because the people of U are starting to understand something that they hadn't before. They no longer expect perfection, nor do they demand that the world justify itself with constant victories or defeats. Instead, they begin to understand that survival and even happiness is found not in grand gestures, but in quiet persistence. The Candy Kingdom, under Princess Bubblegum's guidance, begins to take on a different tone. The policies she enacts are no longer merely about progress and efficiency. They are about sustainability and balance. She begins to favour decisions that preserve the equilibrium of the kingdom's ecosystem, the living, breathing relationships between its citizens, between nature and invention, between work and rest. The changes are subtle but profound. They are built on the quiet foundation of a world that has learned, in the aftermath of Betty's sacrifice, that even in the face of catastrophe, there is always room for hope to grow. Marceline, too, feels the weight of this continuity, though she experiences it in a different way. As a being who has lived for centuries, the idea of continuity is more familiar to her than it is to most. But it has always been a continuity of survival, of carrying on from one moment to the next. Now, with Betty's influence in the air, Marceline feels continuity as a kind of deep, healing calm. The world is still fractured, still chaotic, still unpredictable, but she no longer feels as though she is constantly running. She can pause. She can breathe. She can listen to the world, knowing that it is not asking her to fix it, but to walk alongside it. In the small corners of U, where magic still lingers, the gift of continuity takes on even subtler forms. Spells that once caused chaos or destruction now weave together into something gentler. The use of magic becomes more measured, more patient. It no longer feels like a tool to force reality into submission, but a language through which to listen to it. Even the wildest creatures, who once roamed U in uncontrolled madness, now seem to follow patterns that are slower, more predictable, less destructive. There is still a wildness to them, but it is a wildness tempered with understanding, the understanding that existence in all its forms requires care. And for the people of U, the continuity is felt in the simplest ways. The way a child's laughter echoes through the streets, the way the seasons change without being rushed, the way friendships deepen and communities grow. There is no great event that signals the shift, no single moment that can be pinpointed as the turning point. It is the slow and steady accumulation of moments, of gestures, of small acts of love and care that begin to define U's new age. Betty's act was not about creating a world free of difficulty. It was about giving the world the capacity to endure difficulty with grace. For Simon, the gift of continuity is most evident in the way he begins to live with the memory of Betty, not as a wound, but as a quiet foundation. At first, he could not fathom living without her, without the overwhelming need to make sense of what she did for him. But now, he realizes that he can live with it, not because he has forgotten her, but because he has learned how to carry her love in a way that frees him to live on his own terms. He no longer needs to explain it, and he no longer feels that her sacrifice defines him. Instead, he understands that it was a gift that allows him to walk through the world with an open heart, ready to give and receive love without the burden of perfection. The world around him, and around all of U, has learned that the greatest gift is not the absence of hardship, but the ability to navigate it, with kindness, with patience, with love. Betty's sacrifice has shown them that continuity is not something that must be fought for or controlled. It is something that simply exists, quietly, beneath the surface, waiting for those who choose to honor it. In the gardens of the Candy Kingdom, in the quiet hours after sunset, in the laughter shared over simple meals, the gift of continuity becomes the most enduring legacy of Betty Grof. It is not a gift of grandiosity, but of stillness. It is the gift of being able to walk through the world and know, deeply and without question, that love is not just something we give. It is something we allow the world to continue in. And that allowance is enough. It is more than enough. Simon sits outside one evening, looking up at the stars. The world is quiet. The air is still. He thinks about Betty, about her choices, about the world she left behind. He doesn't need to ask if she's still with him. He feels her in every moment of peace, in every choice to live with openness and kindness. The world she gave him is not a perfect one, but it is a good one. It is a world where continuity, the continuity of love, of memory, of human connection, is more than a distant hope. It is the thread that ties them all together. And for the first time in a long time, Simon can finally rest. Not because everything is fixed, but because everything continues. He feels it in the air. He feels it in the hearts of those he loves. He feels it in his own chest, steady and slow. He knows that this simple, quiet continuity is the greatest gift Betty could have ever given him. And it is enough. There is a truth that sits at the edge of all stories, lingering in the shadows of every beginning and end. Nothing truly ends. No matter how long a story stretches, there will always be another story waiting to rise from it. Betty Grof's sacrifice, her act of pure devotion, may have shifted the world in a fundamental way, but the world she left behind, the world that was healed by her choice, is not a static one. It is a world in motion, a world that will always carry the seed of change. The return of the cycle is not a regrowth of what was once lost, but a re-emergence of potential. The rhythms of U, once dominated by the chaotic whims of power and destruction, now pulse with something gentler, but they still pulse. Life continues to turn, to grow, to change. What Betty understood, perhaps better than anyone, is that love is not a force that can ever be contained. It is the breath of the universe, always expanding and contracting, always weaving new patterns, always finding new forms. In the years that follow her sacrifice, U continues to evolve. The Candy Kingdom thrives under Princess Bubblegum's gentle leadership, but it is not the same kingdom it was before. There are still challenges, still moments of conflict and struggle, but the tone of those challenges has shifted. U has learned, slowly and steadily, that its true strength lies not in the ability to win every battle, but in its ability to learn from them, to evolve through them, to emerge stronger, not by defeating what came before, but by integrating it into something new. The same is true for Simon. His life is no longer defined by what was taken from him, but by what he has reclaimed, not just from the crown, but from the very nature of time and identity. His journey is no longer a straight line. It is a cycle, the cycle of self-discovery, of grief and healing, of love and loss, of finding peace only to discover that there is always more to learn. He is not the same man who once wore the crown, nor is he the same man who stood in the ruins of the Ice King's mind. He is someone who has been changed by everything he has experienced, and that change is what allows him to move forward. For Marceline, the return of the cycle is felt in her music. Her songs are no longer just reflections of her own pain or her endless wanderings through time. They have become more expansive, more inclusive, more about the world she now sees around her. She writes songs not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever felt the weight of loss, the joy of rediscovery, the subtle beauty of living in the aftermath of a world that continues to spin, even when it seems like it should stop. And for U, the cycle is not just personal, it is environmental. The magic that was once wild and unpredictable now finds a new rhythm. There are still flashes of chaos, moments when the world seems to lose its balance, but there is now an understanding that chaos is not the end. It is part of the process. Just as the seasons shift, just as plants die and bloom again, so too does the world of U continue to renew itself. The land is softer, the skies brighter, but the forces of creation and destruction still play their roles, just as they always have. What changes is not their presence, but their purpose. Now, they exist in harmony with the world, not in opposition to it. For Simon, the cycle becomes most apparent in the small mundane moments that he once took for granted. The way the sun rises in the morning, the way the wind shifts with the seasons, the way laughter still sounds the same no matter how much time passes. These moments remind him that life is not a series of linear events. It is a continuous loop, a cycle of beginnings and endings, of challenges and victories, of love and loss, each one feeding into the next. Betty's act of devotion was not the end of the cycle. It was the beginning of a new one that Simon must continue to navigate, learning as he goes, and trusting that each lesson leads to something better. The return of the cycle is also felt in the children of U. They grow up in a world that is shaped by the quiet legacy of Betty's love, but they are not bound by it. They carry her lessons with them, but they also bring new ideas, new dreams, and new perspectives. They live in a world that is no longer defined by the trauma of past wars or the struggles of an imperfect history. They live in a world that has learned to integrate those struggles, to embrace the lessons they offer, and to move forward with an open heart and an open mind. The return of the cycle is not a single event. It is the realization that life and love are not static. They are always moving, always shifting, always returning to themselves. And in that return, there is the potential for growth, for change, for healing. Betty's sacrifice was the beginning of a new cycle, one that would continue long after her name was forgotten, long after the details of her act had faded from memory. The world she left behind will always carry the imprint of her love. But that love will take on new forms, new shapes, as it continues to ripple outward, influencing lives in ways that cannot be predicted. Simon stands at the edge of a new beginning, looking out at the world that Betty helped create. It is a world that is not perfect, but it is a world that is more whole than it was before. And as he takes a step forward into the unknown, he feels the weight of continuity, the weight of history, of memory, of love, pressing gently on his shoulders. He knows that the cycle will continue, that there will be new challenges, new losses, and new beginnings. But he also knows that the cycle is not something to fear, it is something to embrace. The cycle is the gift of continuity. It is the gift of life, of love, of everything that has been and everything that will be. It is not a burden to carry, but a thread to follow. And as Simon steps into the prosperous future, he feels Betty's love still guiding him, still holding him steady, still reminding him that the greatest gift is not to stop the cycle, but to trust in it. In the quiet moments before dawn, there is a sense of finality that hangs over the world, like the last note of a song that lingers in the air long after the music has stopped. It is not an ending, but a conclusion, a point where one chapter of a story closes, but another is already beginning. The end of the beginning is not the finality of death or the absence of purpose. It is the acknowledgement that all things have their cycles, their beginnings and their endings, and that in each moment of transition, something new is born. For U, this moment comes slowly, not with the grand finale of a battle or the collapse of a kingdom, but with the steady, quiet realization that life continues. The world has not returned to the chaos it once knew. It has not fallen back into the same patterns of destruction, division, and uncertainty that marked its earlier days. Instead, it has grown into something more patient, more thoughtful, more aware of the balance between creation and decay. And in that growth, U has reached a point where the beginning no longer feels like a singular event, but a continual process, a state of being that is always in motion. The end of the beginning, then, is not just the final chapter of a story. It is the recognition that the story itself never truly ends. It simply unfolds in new directions, new discoveries, and new perspectives. And in this unfolding, Betty Grof's sacrifice is not the final act, but the seed that continues to sprout and grow, quietly shaping the future of U. For Simon, this understanding of the end of the beginning is personal. He stands at the crossroads of his past and his future, looking back at the life he once had, the man he once was, and the person he is now becoming. He has shed the Ice King's identity, the curse of the crown, and the weight of endless isolation. He is no longer defined by what he lost, but by what he has reclaimed: his humanity, his capacity to love, his connection to the world. But he also knows that this is not the end of his journey. He has learned that life is not linear. It is cyclical, always returning, always evolving. And in that return, there is always something new to learn, something new to experience. The end of the beginning for Simon is not the conclusion of his recovery or the resolution of his story. It is the acceptance that he has become part of something larger, something more expansive than himself. His life is no longer just about redemption or survival. It is about participation in the world, in relationships, in love. He does not know what comes next, but he understands now that whatever it is, it will not be defined by what came before. It will be defined by the choices he makes in the present and the future. For Marceline, the end of the beginning is similarly profound. She has lived for centuries, watching the world around her change, witnessing the passage of time in a way that few others can. But in all those years, she has never experienced the sense of peace that she now feels. It is not the peace of knowing everything will be perfect or that life will always be easy. It is the peace of knowing that life, with all its uncertainties, is worth living. It is the peace of knowing that love, even when it is painful or imperfect, is always worth the risk. And it is the peace of knowing that despite all the chaos of the past, the future is still open, still full of possibilities. Marceline has come to understand that the end of the beginning is not something to fear, it is something to embrace. It is the recognition that nothing in life is fixed and that the only constant is change. And in that change, there is always room for new stories, new adventures, new connections. The end of the beginning is not the end of the world, it is the start of everything else. Princess Bubblegum, too, feels the weight of this realization. She has spent so much of her life trying to control the world around her, to shape it according to her vision, to make it perfect. But she knows now that perfection is not the goal. The goal is understanding that the world is messy, unpredictable, and often imperfect, but that it is also beautiful and worth caring for. The end of the beginning for PB is the acceptance that her role as a ruler is not to create a flawless kingdom, but to nurture a kingdom that can grow and adapt, that can learn from its mistakes and build something better. She is no longer a queen holding everything together. She is a leader guiding others through the process of growth, of change, of transformation. And for the world itself, the end of the beginning is not the closing of one chapter, but the opening of many more. The earth continues to spin, the seasons continue to turn, the people of Oo continue to live and love and struggle and grow. But there is a difference now. The world is more aware of itself. It is more aware of the interconnectedness of all things, of the delicate balance between creation and destruction, between joy and sorrow. It is a world that has learned to value the small moments, the quiet acts of kindness, the subtle shifts that occur when no one is looking. In this world, the end of the beginning is not a finality. It is simply the acknowledgement that life is a continuous, ever-evolving process. It is the recognition that every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. And it is the acceptance that we are all part of that process, that we are all, in some way, part of the ongoing story of the world. For Betty Grof, the end of the beginning is the most fitting conclusion. She did not seek recognition or glory. She did not expect to be remembered as a hero or a saviour. She simply acted out of love, out of devotion, out of the belief that change was possible. And in that act, she set in motion the cycles of transformation that would continue long after her name was forgotten. The end of the beginning, then, is not about reaching an ultimate destination. It is about the journey itself, about how we move forward, how we continue to learn and grow, how we continue to love and care for one another. Betty's legacy is not something that can be captured in a single moment or a single story. It is the quiet, enduring force that shapes the world, that transforms it, that makes it possible for Oo and all the worlds beyond to keep going. And so the story continues. Love, in its purest form, is not an object to possess or a treasure to hold tightly. It is a force that moves through the world, often unnoticed, often unacknowledged, but always present. It does not seek recognition or praise. It seeks only to exist, to flow, to connect. Betty Grof's legacy is not a monument or a title, but a quiet, invisible thread woven into the very fabric of existence, a legacy shaped not by what she did, but by how she loved. Her love was not a grand, sweeping declaration. It was a choice, made every day, often quietly, often without fanfare. It was the choice to stand by Simon when the world had abandoned him. The choice to sacrifice herself, not for glory or for the world's approval, but because she believed in the possibility of love overcoming all obstacles. It was a love that did not demand anything in return, a love that knew no bounds and required no reciprocation. It was the most radical form of love, selfless, unspoken, and enduring. In the years that follow her sacrifice, her love becomes the invisible force that continues to shape U. The world does not remember Betty in the way it remembers heroes and legends. There are no statues, no songs sung in her name, but in the quiet actions of the people she touched, in the small gestures of kindness and understanding, her love continues. Her legacy is not a story told with words, but a story lived through actions. It is the way Simon learns to love without the need for control, the way Marceline writes songs that carry the weight of experience and empathy, the way PB governs not with rigid authority, but with compassion and care. It is the way the world itself begins to reflect the quiet patience of someone who believed in love, even when it seemed impossible. Betty's legacy is also the legacy of the choices she made, the choice to not just save Simon, but to free him, the choice to not cling to him, to not try to keep him as the man he was, but to allow him to become the man he needed to be. Her love was not possessive, it was liberating. It allowed Simon to reclaim his humanity, to return to the world not as a fractured soul, but as a whole person, someone capable of living again. And in that freedom, she gave him the greatest gift, the ability to choose for himself. In U, this legacy continues in the way the people live their lives. The world is not perfect, and it never will be. But there is a new understanding, a new awareness that has taken root. People understand that love is not a transaction, not a trade. It is a commitment to another person's growth, a willingness to let them change, to let them be who they are, not who we want them to be. This is the foundation of Betty's legacy, not in the dramatic moments of sacrifice or heroism, but in the quiet, enduring love that continues to shape the world long after the events have passed. For Simon, the legacy of love is the hardest to grasp. He has spent so much of his life looking for meaning, for purpose, for redemption. He thought that love was something he had to earn, something that came with conditions. But Betty showed him that love is not something to be earned, it is something to be given. And in that giving, it transforms everything. The love that Betty gave him was not a love that sought a return. It was a love that simply existed, as constant and unwavering as the stars in the sky. In her absence, Simon learns to love the world in the same way, not to possess it, but to honour it, to give of himself without expectation. It is not an easy lesson, but it is one he carries with him always. The legacy of love is also felt in the way Marceline lives her life. She has seen so much, lived so long, and witnessed so much loss. But through it all, she has never stopped loving. Not the world, not the people who have come and gone, not even herself. Betty's love for Simon, for U, for life itself, teaches Marceline that love does not end with loss. It transforms. It continues. And in her music, her art, and the way she moves through the world, Marceline carries that love forward. It is the quiet hum that underlies her songs, the steady beat of her heart as she writes and sings. She, too, learns that love is not a gift to be returned. It is a gift to be passed along. For Princess Bubblegum, the legacy of love is the quiet realization that leadership is not about power or control, but about nurturing. She had always believed that the strength of the kingdom lay in its structure, its laws, its control. But Betty's love taught her that true strength lies in the ability to let go, to allow the world to shape itself, to trust in the people she governs. PB begins to lead with a softer hand, listening more, understanding more, and allowing the citizens of U to take ownership of their world. She becomes a leader not by controlling the future, but by creating the space for others to grow. As the years pass, the world of U continues to change, but in ways that are grounded in Betty's love. The people of U no longer see themselves as separate entities, each struggling for survival. They begin to understand that they are all part of a larger whole, a community bound together by the invisible thread of love. They support one another, not because they expect something in return, but because they understand that their strength lies in their ability to lift each other up. In the end, Betty's legacy is not a legacy of victory or conquest. It is a legacy of love, of connection, of quiet but unshakable devotion. She did not seek to change the world through grand acts or force. She changed the world through the simplest act of all, by loving it and by showing others how to love too. Her love was the seed, and U, Simon, Marceline, PB, and every other person, creature, and spirit in it is the garden that continues to grow from it. The beauty of this legacy is that it does not belong to one person, one place, or one time. It belongs to everyone. Betty's love is a gift that is passed down through generations, through actions, through choices, through the quiet, everyday moments that define a life. It is a love that is not bound by time or space, but by the simple truth that love, when given freely, continues to live long after it is given. In the end, Betty Grof's legacy is not a story with a single ending. It is a story that continues, quietly and without fanfare, in the lives of those she touched and the world she left behind. Her love is not a memory, but a living force that endures, growing and evolving with each new generation. And in that enduring love, the world of U lives on, forever shaped by the woman who believed that love, in its purest form, is the greatest power of all. The last goodbye is always the quietest. It is not loud with finality, nor heavy with sorrow. It is the moment when everything that has been said, done, and felt finds its natural conclusion. There is no need for grand declarations or dramatic gestures. The quiet goodbye is the one that carries the weight of everything without needing to prove itself. It is the gentle exhale after a long journey, the stillness that follows the storm, the peace that settles into the heart when all is understood. For U, the last quiet goodbye comes not as a single event, but as a slow, unfolding process. It is felt in the smallest moments, a soft breeze, a final song, a gentle glance shared between friends. There is no singular moment of departure, but a gradual fading, not from life, but from the need to control it. U's story has always been one of constant motion, of challenges faced and battles fought. But in the wake of Betty's sacrifice, in the years that follow, U learns the true art of living, not as warriors or conquerors, but as people who understand that some things are beyond control, beyond manipulation, and beyond time. Simon, for his part, comes to understand this quiet goodbye more fully than anyone. He has lived through so much, through the madness of the crown, the isolation of the Ice King, and the pain of losing Betty. But now, standing in a world that no longer asks him to save it, he learns that the greatest act of love is not in fixing the world, but in simply allowing it to be. He no longer needs to hold on to every memory or chase every answer, He no longer needs to know what comes next. For the first time, he can simply exist without the burden of expectation, without the weight of his past. And in that quiet existence, he finds peace. The quiet goodbye comes not when he lets go of Betty's memory, but when he accepts it. When he accepts that her sacrifice was not a weight for him to carry, but a gift he was always meant to receive. He understands now that love does not ask for anything in return. It simply exists, quietly, patiently, waiting to be felt. Betty's love continues to shape him, not as a constant source of sorrow or guilt, but as a quiet, enduring presence in his life. It is not something he can fully explain, nor something he needs to. It simply is. Marceline, too, feels the quiet goodbye. She has spent so much of her immortal life searching for something to anchor her, something to give her purpose. But as the years go on, she begins to understand that purpose is not a destination. It is a journey of embracing the world as it is, of accepting both its chaos and its beauty. Betty's sacrifice, her quiet act of love, becomes the catalyst for Marceline's own transformation. She learns to let go of the need to control her fate, to stop searching for meaning in every moment, and to simply allow herself to live. The quiet goodbye is not a sorrowful departure for Marceline, but a release from the need to constantly chase meaning and a quiet acceptance of life as it comes. For Princess Bubblegum, the quiet goodbye is more complex. She has always been the protector, the ruler, the one who tries to fix everything. But through Betty's example, PB learns that true leadership is not about control. It is about trust. Trust in others. Trust in the world. Trust in the possibility of growth and change. She begins to rule not with an iron fist, but with a gentle hand, guiding Ooh with the understanding that some things are beyond her control. The quiet goodbye for PB comes when she finally accepts that the kingdom and the world will continue on without her constant intervention. She does not need to fix everything. She only needs to guide, to support, and to trust that the world has its own way of healing. The final act of the quiet goodbye is felt across Ooh, not in any grand gesture, but in the way people live their lives. The children of Ooh, the future generation, grow up with the lessons of love, sacrifice, and acceptance. They do not know Betty by name, but they carry her legacy in their hearts, in the way they treat each other, in the way they face the world with kindness and patience. They grow up in a world that has learned, through the sacrifices of the past, that life does not have to be a struggle. It can be a dance, a gentle ebb and flow, where love guides every movement, every decision, every interaction. And then, one day, as all things must, the world pauses. The seasons shift, the sky changes, and the last quiet goodbye is felt not as an event, but as a shift in the air, a deep sigh of acceptance that carries across Ooh. It is not a moment of loss, but a moment of understanding. The world has continued. It has grown. It has changed. And in that change, Betty Grof's legacy lives on. Not in the monuments built to her memory, but in the way the world continues to love, continues to heal, continues to evolve. For Simon, for Marceline, for PB, and for all of Ooh, the last quiet goodbye is not an end. It is a beginning. It is the acceptance that life, with all its beauty and imperfection, continues, not because it must, but because it can. And in that continuation, Betty's love remains quiet, steady, always there. And so, the world moves forward, not as a world of endings, but as a world of beginnings. The quiet goodbye is not the closing of a chapter, but the turning of a page. It is the gentle reminder that life, no matter how difficult or uncertain, always continues. It continues in the love we give, in the love we receive, and in the love we allow the world to grow. Betty's legacy is not a memory to be cherished, but a living, breathing force that continues to shape, one quiet act of love at a time.